"Sir, are you my blind date?" the new bodyguard said to a lonely billionaire. He didn't expect his life to tilt in a quiet restaurant over a simple question that wasn't meant for him. Graham Whitmore sat still, hands folded, eyes distant, thinking this night would be short and controlled. No emotions, no surprises, just another test, another decision made from a distance. Then the woman stopped at his table, and everything shifted. She looked at the reservation, then at him, calm and unsure at the same time. She didn't smile. She didn't hesitate. Her voice was steady, almost casual, like she'd practiced saying it in her head. "Sir, are you my blind date?" The words landed heavier than she could have imagined. If you believe in compassion and the quiet strength of ordinary people, take a moment to like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us how one small act can change everything. For a second, Graham didn't answer. Not because he was confused, but because something inside him froze. No one had spoken to him like that in years. No fear, no recognition, no calculation. Just a human question, asked honestly. Around them, the restaurant kept moving. Forks clinked, glasses touched. Laughter floated past their table. But for Graham, the sound faded. All he saw was a woman standing there, waiting for clarity, waiting for truth. She noticed his silence and felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't how blind dates were supposed to start. Her mother had promised this would be simple, awkward, maybe, but harmless. Not this. Graham finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. He could have ended it right there. He could have corrected her, stood up, and walked away. That's what the old version of him would have done. But he didn't. Instead, he stayed silent a second longer. Long enough for curiosity to beat control. Long enough for something human to break through routine. And in that pause, without knowing it, both of them stepped into a story neither had planned to enter. Because sometimes, the most important moments don't arrive loudly. They arrive disguised as misunderstandings, as questions meant for someone else. And before you realize it, you're already inside a choice that can't be undone. Graham Whitmore wasn't the kind of man who believed in coincidences anymore. At 42, widowed, and emotionally guarded, he'd built a life where every interaction had a purpose. Every meeting was planned. Every risk was calculated. This dinner, at least in his mind, was no different. He believed it was part of a discreet evaluation set up by a close friend, another billionaire who understood how fragile trust could be when your life was always under watch. What Graham didn't believe in was mixing personal life with decisions that affected his safety. After losing his wife years earlier, he'd learned to separate emotions from survival. He trusted systems, contracts, and people who came recommended through layers of verification. That night was supposed to be simple. Observe, assess, decide. Nothing about it was meant to feel human, and definitely nothing was meant to feel personal. Claire Morgan walked into that restaurant carrying a completely different story in her chest. At 32, her life had been shaped by discipline, training, and long days where feelings came second. Her mother had insisted she needed a life beyond work, beyond routines built around protection and control. The blind date had been framed as harmless. Just dinner, just conversation, just a chance to try being normal for once. But Claire never did anything halfway. She'd been told clearly that after the date, she'd need to move fast. There was a professional test scheduled later that night, an important client, an event, a real-world evaluation. That's why she wore a black suit, white shirt, black tie, and kept her hair pulled back tight. She wasn't dressed for romance. She was dressed for responsibility, even if she didn't fully understand how the two worlds were about to collide. What Claire didn't know was that her mother was the half-sister of the very man who'd recommended her for this path, the same friend Graham trusted, the same man who had quietly paid for her training, her tests, and every door that had opened for her. To Claire, it was family support mixed with opportunity. To Graham, it was a trusted recommendation. Neither of them knew they were standing at opposite ends of the same decision. When Graham looked at her standing there, dressed like a professional and speaking like someone expecting honesty, something unsettled him. This wasn't how evaluations usually began. There was no formal introduction, no prepared questions. Just a woman who believed she was on a date, and a man realizing the plan hadn't gone the way it was drawn. For the first time in years, Graham wasn't in control of the narrative. Claire felt it too. His silence wasn't rude, but it was heavy. She wondered if she'd misread everything. Maybe her mother had pushed too hard. Maybe this was a mistake. Still, she stayed. Years of training had taught her one thing clearly. When things don't go as planned, you don't run, you assess, you breathe, you stay present. Around them, the restaurant carried on like nothing extraordinary was happening. People laughed. Servers moved between tables. Soft music filled the air. But between Graham and Claire, an invisible tension settled in. Two lives built on control were brushing against something unpredictable. Neither of them knew yet that this misunderstanding wasn't an error. It was the beginning of a choice that would quietly reshape both of them. Because while Graham believed this night was a test of trust, and Claire believed it was a test of normalcy, the truth sat somewhere in between. And neither of them realized yet that staying at that table would ask more from them than any contract ever could. The misunderstanding didn't last long, but the silence that followed it mattered more than the explanation itself. Claire spoke first, calmly clarifying that she believed this dinner had been arranged as a blind date by her mother. She said it without embarrassment, without apology, like someone stating a simple fact. Graham listened closely, realizing in real time that the careful plan his friend had set in motion had collided with something deeply human. Graham could have corrected the situation immediately. He could have explained who he was, why he was there, and why this meeting wasn't supposed to look like this. That would have been the clean solution, the professional solution. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way Claire wasn't trying to impress him. Maybe it was the fact that she didn't know his name meant power. For the first time in years, he was being seen without a title attached. Claire noticed his hesitation and felt a flicker of doubt. She wondered if she should excuse herself, call her mother, or laugh it off as an awkward mistake. But she didn't. Years of discipline had taught her that clarity often came after discomfort. She stayed seated, shoulders straight, hands calm, meeting Graham's eyes without pressure. Whatever this was, she was willing to face it, honestly. Graham finally spoke, choosing his words carefully. He admitted there had been a mix-up, but didn't reveal everything. Not yet. He suggested they stay for dinner anyway. Not as a date, but simply as two people who'd shown up expecting different things. It was a small decision, but one that carried weight. In choosing to stay, Graham stepped outside the rigid structure he'd built to protect himself. As the waiter returned to take their order, the tension softened just enough for conversation to begin. They talked about neutral things at first. Work, schedules, the city. Claire mentioned her training, her routine, the way her life had always revolved around being prepared. Graham listened more than he spoke, realizing how long it had been since he'd done that without an agenda. What neither of them said out loud was that this dinner had already changed its purpose. It was no longer about a blind date, and it wasn't just an evaluation either. It had become a shared moment of choice. Stay or leave, open up or retreat, and both of them, quietly, chose to stay. Claire felt something unfamiliar as the minutes passed. Not attraction exactly, but a sense of being seen for more than her role. Graham felt it too, a subtle shift in the way the evening unfolded. This wasn't control, this wasn't strategy, this was presence. And presence, he realized, was far more dangerous than any threat he'd ever prepared for. By the time the plates arrived, the original plan no longer mattered. What mattered was that two guarded lives had been nudged onto a new path by a simple misunderstanding. Neither of them knew yet where it would lead, but deep down, both sensed that walking away now would mean returning to a life that suddenly felt smaller than it had an hour earlier. And as the dinner continued, one unspoken question lingered between them. If staying had already changed this much, what would happen if they allowed themselves to keep choosing each other, even when it got complicated? As the dinner moved forward, something quietly unsettling began to surface for both of them. It wasn't tension in the traditional sense, but a deeper kind of discomfort that comes when familiar defenses stop working. Graham realized that without his name, his status, or his usual emotional distance, he didn't quite know how to exist in that moment. For years, control had been his shield, and suddenly, it wasn't there. Claire felt exposed in a different way. She was used to being evaluated physically, professionally, tactically, but this felt personal. Sitting across from a man who listened without interrupting, without judging, made her feel seen in a way she wasn't prepared for. She spoke about discipline and training because those were safe topics. But underneath, there was a quiet loneliness she rarely acknowledged out loud. Graham noticed the pauses in her voice, the moments where she stopped herself from saying more. He recognized that restraint because it mirrored his own. Loss had taught him how to close doors gently but firmly. After his wife's death, he'd learned that staying emotionally distant felt safer than risking another kind of pain he wasn't sure he could survive again. The deeper the conversation went, the more both of them sensed how alone they truly were, despite living very different lives. Claire had family, but no one she leaned on emotionally. Graham had resources, influence, and power, but no one who truly knew him anymore. The table between them started to feel less like a place for dinner and more like a space where two guarded lives were momentarily laid bare. Claire admitted, almost casually, that she didn't remember the last time she'd gone out just to enjoy someone's company. Her life had always been about readiness, about anticipating danger, about being useful. Graham responded with a quiet nod, realizing he couldn't remember the last time someone sat with him without wanting something attached to his name or his money. There was a heaviness in that realization, a shared understanding that neither of them had planned to confront that night. Vulnerability had crept in without permission. Neither of them was asking for help, but both were standing in the same emotional space where help might someday be possible. It was uncomfortable, raw, and strangely grounding at the same time. As dessert menus were offered, Claire glanced at the time, remembering the professional test waiting after dinner. Graham noticed the shift in her focus, the way responsibility pulled her back toward structure. Part of him felt relief at the thought of returning to something familiar. Another part, one he hadn't listened to in years, felt an unexpected disappointment. Neither of them said it out loud, but both felt the same quiet fear. If this moment ended here, it would be easier, but it would also mean retreating back into lives built on distance and self-protection. And as the check arrived, that unspoken question lingered heavily between them. Was walking away really the safer choice anymore? The shift didn't happen all at once. It came quietly, through timing rather than words. When the dinner ended, Claire stood up with the same composed posture she'd arrived with, already transitioning mentally from something personal to something professional. She explained, calmly and without drama, that she had another commitment that night, a test arranged through the agency. Graham listened, his attention sharpening when he realized the evening wasn't actually over. Less than an hour later, Graham saw her again, but this time the context had changed everything. Claire appeared outside the venue where his driver waited, dressed exactly as she had been at dinner, but now her presence made complete sense. The suit wasn't out of place. The posture wasn't social. She was there to work. In that moment, Graham understood that the mix-up hadn't been random. It had simply been poorly explained. As they drove toward the event, Claire clarified what she could without oversharing. The test had been scheduled weeks earlier. One night, one event. Observe how she handled real environments, not staged drills. Graham connected the dots slowly, realizing that the recommendation had come from his closest friend, the same man who'd insisted Claire was ready, the man he trusted with decisions that mattered. What surprised Graham most wasn't the professionalism Claire showed, but how seamlessly she shifted between roles without losing herself. She wasn't colder now. She wasn't distant. She was simply focused. And in that focus, Graham saw something rare. Someone who didn't perform confidence, but lived it quietly, without asking for validation or recognition. During the event, Claire moved through the space with calm precision. She didn't draw attention. She didn't dominate the room. She simply anticipated needs before they surfaced. Graham watched her from a distance, noticing how people relaxed around her without realizing why. It wasn't authority that made them feel safe. It was steadiness. At one point, Graham caught her eye across the room. Just for a second, there was no smile, no signal, no shared joke, but the look carried recognition. Not of status, not of power, of something human, of two people who had met once under false assumptions and were now seeing each other clearly for the first time. Later that night, as the event wound down without incident, Graham felt an unfamiliar sense of relief, not because he'd been protected physically, but because the presence beside him felt grounding. He realized that trust wasn't something he'd lost entirely after his wife's death. It had just been waiting for the right place to land again. Claire sensed the shift too, though she didn't name it. For years, her work had been about distance, keep space, maintain boundaries, but something about working with Graham felt different, not easier, more meaningful, like her presence mattered beyond the checklist of responsibilities she'd memorized. As they parted ways that night, neither of them acknowledged what had changed. They didn't label it, they didn't analyze it, but both understood one thing clearly. This hadn't been just a test anymore. Something deeper had begun to form, quietly and without permission, and neither of them knew yet what it would ask of them next. In the days that followed, Graham made a decision that surprised even himself. He didn't treat Claire's presence as a temporary arrangement or a one-night evaluation. Instead, he extended the contract, slowly at first, framing it as continuity for security reasons. What he didn't say out loud was that her presence had shifted something in him, something he hadn't felt steady in years. Claire accepted the extended assignment without hesitation, though she noticed the subtle change in rhythm between them. Their interactions became more frequent, more layered. Flights, meetings, quiet car rides, long waits outside conference rooms. She stayed alert, professional, and grounded, but there was also space now for small conversations that weren't strictly necessary, moments where silence felt shared instead of enforced. Graham began to realize that he wasn't just being protected, he was being accompanied. Claire didn't try to fill the quiet with talk, and she didn't retreat into formality either. She simply stayed present, and that presence made him confront something uncomfortable. He had built his life to avoid depending on anyone emotionally, but now he found himself leaning into the stability she offered. For Claire, the work began to feel heavier in a different way, not because of danger or pressure, but because she cared. She paid attention to Graham's moods, the way he went quiet during long drives, the way certain places seemed to pull him inward. She never asked questions that crossed a line, but she adjusted her presence, giving him space when he needed it, and grounding him when he didn't realize he did. There were choices Graham had to make that went beyond schedules and logistics. He rearranged meetings so she wouldn't be pushed into unsafe hours. He insisted on rest periods that weren't technically required. These weren't grand gestures. They were quiet decisions rooted in care rather than obligation, and each one chipped away at the emotional distance he'd spent years perfecting. Claire noticed those choices and felt something shift in her own boundaries. She wasn't used to being considered in that way. Her work had always been about service, not mutual regard. Yet here was a man who saw her not just as protection, but as a person carrying weight of her own. That recognition settled deeply, awakening a sense of worth she hadn't allowed herself to feel. They didn't talk about emotions directly. Instead, connection grew through actions, through shared routines, through trust built slowly, brick by brick. Graham found himself opening up in small ways, mentioning his wife, not as a wound, but as a memory that still lived with him. Claire listened without pity, without urgency, letting the truth exist without trying to fix it. As days turned into weeks, Graham began to notice something subtle but undeniable. His life no longer felt like a series of tasks to survive. There was rhythm again, not excitement, not chaos, but rhythm. Claire's presence created structure without stiffness, and that balance affected him more than he expected. He started scheduling his days with a different kind of care, leaving space instead of filling every minute with obligation. Claire noticed those changes immediately. She saw how Graham began asking questions that weren't strictly necessary. Not invasive, not emotional, just human. He asked if she'd eaten, if the drive had been too long, if the schedule felt unreasonable. These were small things, but to Claire, they mattered. Her work had always been about protecting others, rarely about being protected herself, even in the simplest ways. There were moments when Graham struggled internally. He caught himself wanting to share more, then pulling back, unsure if he was crossing a line he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Grief had taught him to hesitate before opening doors. But kindness, real kindness, had a way of staying patient. Claire never pushed. She never asked for explanations. She simply stayed consistent, allowing trust to deepen naturally. One evening, After a long flight, Graham looked visibly drained. Claire suggested a slower exit, nothing dramatic, just choosing calm over efficiency. He agreed without argument, surprising himself. That choice stayed with him. It was the first time in years he'd chosen his well-being over optics, and it felt right, not indulgent, responsible. For Claire, this assignment began reshaping her sense of purpose. She realized she wasn't just reacting to risk anymore. She was actively creating safety, not through force, but through attentiveness. That kind of protection felt deeper, more aligned with who she was becoming. It wasn't about guarding a body. It was about holding space for someone learning to breathe again. Graham started to recognize that his fight wasn't against danger, the press, or uncertainty. His real fight was against the instinct to withdraw when things felt meaningful. Every day he chose to keep Claire close, professionally and personally. He was choosing courage over habit. That realization didn't scare him as much as it used to. It grounded him. And somewhere in that routine of airports, meetings, and quiet conversations, both of them understood something important. This wasn't about romance yet. It was about showing up, about choosing generosity in small moments, about fighting, not against each other or the world, but for the possibility that life could still expand instead of contract. By the time weeks had passed, it was clear that this wasn't about safety protocols anymore. Graham wasn't fighting a threat. He was fighting for something fragile and unfamiliar, the chance to let someone stand beside him without armor. And as that realization settled in, a new question quietly emerged. How much was he willing to risk to keep that feeling alive? The moment that changed everything didn't arrive with sirens or chaos. It came quietly, during an evening that was supposed to be routine. Graham was attending a mid-sized public charity event. Nothing high-profile, nothing that usually raised alarms. The room was full of polite conversations, donors shaking hands, and speeches that blurred together. On paper, it was safe. In reality, it was unpredictable in a different way. A small logistical confusion began near the entrance. Guests started clustering in the wrong area. Staff whispered urgently to each other. Nothing dangerous, but enough to shift the energy in the room. Claire noticed it immediately, not because she was searching for threats, but because she paid attention to people. She stepped in calmly, redirecting movement, easing tension without drawing attention to herself or to Graham. Graham watched from a distance as she worked. He noticed how her presence didn't escalate the situation, but softened it. People listened to her without knowing why. Voices lowered. Frustration faded. What struck him wasn't her authority, but her care. She wasn't protecting him from something. She was protecting the moment from becoming heavier than it needed to be. When the confusion resolved, Claire returned to Graham's side without comment, as if nothing unusual had happened. But Graham felt it. The shift inside him was undeniable. For years, safety had meant walls, distance, and control. What he felt now was different. It was a sense of being held emotionally, even in a room full of strangers. That realization landed quietly, but deeply. As the evening continued, Graham became aware of how differently he was experiencing the event compared to similar nights in the past. Usually, these gatherings blurred together, faces and conversations fading as soon as he left the room. This time, he was present, not because he felt exposed, but because he felt anchored. Claire's calm presence nearby allowed him to lower his guard without realizing it. Claire remained attentive without hovering. She read the room with quiet precision, noticing shifts in energy rather than threats. A raised voice here, a frustrated glance there, small human tensions that could grow if ignored. She intervened softly, offering directions and reassurance in a steady tone that diffused confusion before it spread. Graham watched this unfold and felt something unexpected stir inside him. For years, he'd equated protection with force, barriers, and distance. What he saw now was different. Claire wasn't shielding him from the world. She was helping the world around him breathe more easily. Later, during a brief pause between speeches, Graham noticed his body language change. His shoulders weren't tense. His jaw wasn't clenched. He wasn't scanning exits or counting minutes. He was listening. He hadn't felt this unguarded in public since before his wife passed away. Claire noticed the shift in him too. She saw how his posture softened, how his gaze lingered longer instead of darting away. It told her something important. This wasn't just about doing her job well. It was about trust being built in real time, through presence. When the event began to wind down, Graham felt a quiet reluctance for the night to end, not because of the setting, but because of what it had allowed him to feel. As they waited to leave, he turned to Claire and said something simple and unplanned. He told her that the room had felt different tonight. That exchange stayed with both of them as they stepped back into the night. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And in that reality, a deeper connection had taken root, grounded in care. Whatever came next would carry more weight than either of them had expected. Later that evening, as they waited for the car, Graham broke a silence he usually guarded carefully. He thanked her, not in the formal way he thanked staff, but simply, honestly. Claire nodded, accepting it without deflection. She didn't minimize what she'd done, but she didn't inflate it either. To her, it was just the right thing to do in that moment. That exchange stayed with Graham long after the car pulled away. He realized that trust wasn't just about feeling safe from harm. It was about feeling understood in moments when nothing dramatic was happening. Claire wasn't reacting to danger. She was responding to human discomfort, and that mattered more than he'd expected. For Claire, the night settled differently. She wasn't proud in the way she'd been after physical tests or tactical drills. Instead, she felt quietly aligned, like she'd acted not just as a professional, but as herself. And for the first time, that felt seen, not praised publicly, not evaluated, simply noticed. As they drove away, the city lights passing in soft blurs, neither of them spoke, but both understood that something had shifted beyond contracts and roles. A line hadn't been crossed, but it had become visible. And once you see a line like that, pretending it isn't there becomes impossible. The shift into something deeper didn't come during a crisis, but during a moment that was supposed to be simple. Graham brought Claire to a small family gathering for his niece's birthday, an informal setting where titles didn't matter and expectations were low. He framed it as logistics, a normal part of his schedule, but internally he knew this was different. This was the first time in years he allowed someone from his professional life into a space that still carried warmth. The house was full of noise, children running between rooms, adults laughing without worrying about posture or image. Claire entered carefully, aware of her role but relaxed enough not to perform it. She stayed observant, yet approachable, letting the environment breathe. Graham noticed how naturally she blended in, how no one felt watched or guarded around her. That ease unsettled him in the best way. For Claire, the setting stirred something unfamiliar. She wasn't used to spaces like this, where safety wasn't something she had to create. Families like this reminded her of what she'd postponed for years. Her mother's insistence on the blind date suddenly made sense in a deeper way. It wasn't pressure. It was worry that Claire had been living without softness. As the afternoon unfolded, Graham found himself talking more than he usually did. Not about business or logistics, but about small memories, childhood stories, moments that still carried tenderness. Claire listened quietly, never interrupting, never steering the conversation. She understood that being present was sometimes the most generous thing a person could offer. The turning point came without warning. Graham's niece tugged on his sleeve, eyes wide with curiosity, watching Claire move through the room with gentle attention. In a clear, innocent voice, she asked, "Uncle, is she my new aunt?" The room went still for half a second. Laughter followed, but the question lingered heavier than anyone expected. Graham felt the weight of that moment immediately. He tried to laugh it off, redirecting the attention playfully, but something in his chest tightened. He turned to Claire, half expecting her to deflect, to restore the safe distance they'd both maintained. Instead, she met the child's gaze with warmth, unguarded and sincere. Claire crouched down slightly and answered with a soft smile, saying, "I'd love to be." She didn't think about implications or consequences. She spoke from a place of openness that surprised even herself. The words weren't a promise, but they weren't empty either. They carried possibility, offered gently and without demand. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. Graham felt something break open inside him, not painfully, but honestly. For the first time since losing his wife, The idea of a future that included connection didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like permission. And as that realization settled, he knew this wasn't a moment he could simply walk away from, unchanged. The reframe came days later, not in a dramatic setting, but in a quiet moment Graham didn't plan for. He was alone in his office late at night, sorting through old paperwork he'd avoided for years. Contracts, reports, and personal items blurred together until he found a letter he hadn't opened in a long time. It was written by his late wife, addressed to a future version of him she knew he'd resist becoming. He read it slowly, feeling the weight of every familiar line. She wrote about fear, about how love doesn't disappear just because pain arrives. She reminded him that choosing connection again wouldn't erase what they had shared. It would honor it. The letter ended with a simple request, asking him not to confuse safety with isolation, and not to let grief become the only voice he trusted. That night, Graham couldn't stop thinking about Claire. Not about what she represented, but about how she made space for him without asking anything in return. He realized that what unsettled him most wasn't the possibility of romance, but the possibility of healing. Letting someone close meant admitting he was still capable of being affected, still capable of choosing differently. Claire had her own moment of reckoning around the same time. Her mother called, nervous but hopeful, asking how the blind date had gone. Claire didn't give details. Instead, she admitted something she'd never said out loud before. She was tired of living only in preparation mode, tired of postponing life for a future that never seemed to arrive. Saying it made it real. When Graham finally spoke to Claire about the letter, he didn't dramatize it. He didn't frame it as a confession. He simply told her that someone he loved once had reminded him that choosing people wasn't weakness. Claire listened carefully, understanding that he wasn't asking for anything. He was sharing something sacred, something that changed how he saw himself. That exchange shifted the ground between them, not forward into romance, but deeper into understanding. They weren't filling gaps in each other's lives. They were standing beside each other, whole but still healing. That distinction mattered. It meant whatever came next would be chosen freely, not out of need or fear. Graham began to see the entire sequence of events differently. The blind date confusion, the professional test, the family moment. None of it felt accidental anymore. Not because it was fate, but because he'd finally allowed himself to notice what had been offered. He hadn't been tested. He'd been invited. Claire felt it too. She realized that the strength she'd built over years didn't need to be softened to allow closeness. It could coexist with care, with warmth, with vulnerability. For the first time, she considered a future that wasn't defined by readiness alone, but by presence and shared direction. As that understanding settled in, one truth became clear to both of them. This wasn't a story about fixing each other. It was about choosing to walk forward without armor, even when the path was uncertain. And that realization opened a door neither of them could unsee, no matter how carefully they tried to close it. The weeks that followed didn't bring dramatic announcements or sudden changes. Instead, life softened around them in small, steady ways. Graham kept Claire on as part of his team, but the dynamic between them had matured into something quieter and more intentional. Meetings felt less rushed. Silences felt less heavy. The guarded edges of his life no longer pressed so tightly against everything he did. Claire noticed the difference too. She didn't feel like she was constantly bracing herself anymore. Working beside Graham began to feel less like a role she stepped into and more like a rhythm she shared. She stayed professional, stayed grounded, but allowed herself to exist fully in the moments between responsibility. For the first time, her strength didn't require distance to survive. They never rushed the conversation about what they were becoming. Instead, they allowed meaning to grow through consistency. Morning briefings turned into shared coffee. Long drives became spaces for reflection instead of silence. Graham spoke more freely about his past, not as a wound, but as something integrated into who he was. Claire listened, offering presence instead of solutions. There were still boundaries, still awareness of timing and responsibility. Neither of them confused possibility with obligation. What they shared wasn't an escape from reality, but a deeper engagement with it. Graham found himself making decisions based not only on efficiency, but on care. Claire began imagining a future that included balance instead of constant readiness. One evening, after a long day, they walked side by side without needing to talk. The city moved around them, busy and indifferent, while something calm settled between them. Graham realized that love didn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived as peace, as steadiness, as the absence of fear where fear once lived. Claire felt it too, though she didn't name it. She felt less alone in her own life, less like she was standing guard over an empty space. Being near Graham didn't make her smaller or distracted. It made her feel seen in her entirety, not just in her competence. That recognition carried its own quiet power. They didn't define what came next. They didn't need to. What mattered was that both of them had chosen openness over retreat, healing over isolation, connection over control. Whatever the future held would be faced honestly, without armor or pretense. And as they moved forward, one truth stayed gently present. This wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a life shaped by kindness, trust, and the courage to let someone walk beside you again. What they would become together remained unwritten, waiting patiently for the next choice. Thanks for listening. If this story touched your heart, subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories that remind us that goodness is still alive in the world. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. See you in the next story.